In November of 1998, in the quiet town of Ashland, Oregon, on the edge of a thinning forest, stood a small house with peeling white paint and a chimney that no longer smoked as often as it once did. It was the kind of house that didn't draw attention, nestled behind leafless trees and half-fallen fences, forgotten by most, remembered only by routine. This was where Rachel Lawrence lived, a 74-year-old widow whose life had narrowed to the perimeter of that house and the worn path between porch and mailbox. A year had passed since her husband, Frank, died from cancer. Since then, the silence inside the house had changed its nature. It no longer offered comfort or rest. It had grown thick, stale, and suffocating. The kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls, to follow her from room to room. She spoke less. There was no one to answer, no voice to return hers. Her daughter, who lived in Minnesota, called rarely and wrote even less. The neighbors who once waved across driveways had long since moved away or turned into strangers with new schedules, new lives, and little time for the woman at the end of the street. Rachel spent most of her days in a rocking chair by the front window, the one that faced the woods. She no longer watched for anything in particular, just the shifting light, the snow when it came, the shape of branches scratching at the sky. The floor creaked under her when she walked, a lonely echo in a house too large for one person. Her mornings followed a rigid script: rise slowly, heat yesterday's coffee, open the blinds, check the mailbox, return to the chair. The clock ticked, though the hours rarely meant anything. The television often played static or muted news, which she didn't listen to. Sometimes at night, she caught sight of a barn owl perched on the leaning utility pole at the end of the road. It returned now and then, silent and still, its yellow eyes like watchful moons. It was the only other presence she'd come to expect, and even that came and went with the seasons. The cold had crept into her life without being noticed. Not just the cold that seeped through old window frames and drafty doorways, but the cold of distance, of disconnection. Her body had adjusted to it, wrapped in sweaters and blankets, but something deeper had not. There was a frost somewhere inside, quiet and persistent, spreading slowly over time. Rachel no longer expected change. Each day unfolded like a carbon copy of the last. Not painful, just numb, steady, indistinct. Life hadn't ended, not exactly, but it had paused in place, and there was no clear sign of when or if it would resume. The first snow came early that year. Without warning, it draped itself over the trees and rooftops of Ashland, blanketing the town in soft, white silence, as though winter had quietly decided to take up residence ahead of schedule. The sky, which had remained a dull slate gray for days, finally gave in and began to shed slow, heavy flakes that spiraled down like forgotten memories. They settled onto the cracked sidewalks, the rusting mailbox, and the brittle hedges that lined Rachel Lawrence's front yard. By evening, darkness had fallen completely, and the town disappeared into quiet. The wind tapped softly at the windows and groaned through the eaves. Rachel sat in her usual place by the window, her chair creaking gently as she rocked. She was used to the noises, the wind, the creaks, the occasional scratching from raccoons that wandered too close to the garbage bins. Normally, she wouldn't have looked up. But something shifted in the air that night. A sound, soft but different, brushed against the edges of her awareness. Not a knock or a call, but a movement, barely there. Her eyes drifted toward the front window, scanning the dim halo of light cast by the old street lamp at the end of the walkway. At first, she saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then, just at the edge of the porch steps, something stirred. It was a shape, small, low to the ground, nearly swallowed by the accumulating snow. She leaned forward slightly, her breath fogging the glass. The shape moved again, just barely. A faint tremble, a shift of a limb. It was a dog, curled tightly on the porch, half covered in snow. Its fur was matted with ice, and it lay so still that for a moment she wasn't sure it was alive. One of its ears twitched, and the faintest motion of a tail brushed weakly against the wooden step. It hadn't come there by accident. Somehow it had made its way to her door, as if following some invisible trail only it could sense. Rachel didn't pause to think. Her body, slow and careful for years, moved with a kind of quiet urgency. She opened the front door, letting a gust of cold air wrap around her like a forgotten coat. The dog didn't flinch, didn't lift its head. It simply lay there, exhausted, surrendered to whatever would happen next. Rachel bent down, her knees stiff, and carefully scooped the small, trembling body into her arms. It was lighter than expected, just bones wrapped in fur and ice. Inside, the warmth of the house seemed too much for the animal at first. It didn't struggle or resist. She placed it gently by the old radiator in the living room, on top of a folded quilt she hadn't touched in months. It was the one that used to lie at the foot of Frank's bed. She pulled another blanket around the dog, tucking it close. Its eyes were closed, but it breathed, shallow and steady. Rachel sat down beside it, not saying a word. Her hand hovered for a moment, then settled on the edge of the blanket. The radiator hissed softly. Snow continued to fall outside. The television buzzed in the next room, forgotten. The house, so long emptied of warmth, seemed to shift almost imperceptibly. And for the first time in a very long time, Rachel wasn't alone. The days passed slowly, measured not by the clock, but by small, almost imperceptible changes in the house. The dog remained near the radiator at first, barely moving except to shift her weight or adjust the angle of her thin body beneath the blanket. Her eyes stayed open most of the time, watching, always watching. Rachel began calling her little one, a name spoken gently, never with finality. She didn't dare name her, as if doing so might tie them together in a way she wasn't ready for, as if a name would make her real in a way Rachel might not be able to bear. The dog didn't eat at first. Food was placed beside her, dry toast, softened by broth, small bits of apple, crumbs of bread, but it would sit untouched for hours. Then one morning, a crust disappeared. The next day, a slice was licked clean. With each bite, however small, something shifted in the house. Not in sound or sight, but in feeling. It was as if the very air began to move again, like a long shuttered window finally opened, letting something living back inside. The house, once heavy with silence, became subtly different. The dog did not bark, did not whine. Her presence was quiet, like a shadow that had learned to stay still. Yet Rachel felt it. She felt the weight of those eyes following her through each room. They were not fearful, nor demanding, just constant. In their steadiness, Rachel found something unexpected. Comfort. She began to move with more purpose. She stood longer in the kitchen. She washed dishes not immediately, but with care, almost ritual. She warmed up the oven and, one afternoon, rolled out pie crust for the first time in over a year. The scent of cinnamon and butter drifted through the rooms, unfamiliar and familiar at once. Her hands, stiff and weathered from arthritis, remembered the motion, as if the muscles held the memory of joy. She started to speak aloud again, not to the dog, but to herself, to the walls, to the corners that had listened in silence for too long. Her voice, once trapped in her chest, began to stretch, to hum, to test its shape in the open air. The house absorbed her words and echoed them gently, like a cathedral with no congregation. She didn't need answers, just the act of hearing her own sound was enough. The dog's condition improved with time. She began to stand on shaky legs, to follow Rachel from room to room, always at a cautious distance. By dusk, she would settle near the rocking chair, curling up at Rachel's feet. Her breath was soft, her gaze unblinking, and there was something sacred in her stillness. as though she were guarding something fragile and unspoken. Rachel, in turn, began to knit again. Her needles clicked quietly in the evenings, her fingers working yarn into shape as they had many winters before. She wasn't sure what she was making, a scarf, perhaps, or just a long strand of comfort. Her fingers moved more easily now, as if warmed by the steady presence of the creature beside her. It wasn't companionship in the ordinary sense. There were no games, no tricks, no commands obeyed. But between them stretched something intangible, like a thread gently tying one soul to another. They existed in the same space, not needing to speak, not needing to understand, simply sharing the silence that once separated them. And in that silence, something small but vital began to grow. In the final days of December, the storm arrived without warning. It came like a closing fist, fast, sharp, unrelenting. Winds howled across the valley, shaking windows in their frames and tearing through the trees with a sound that resembled an ancient, unearthly roar. Snow followed in thick waves, not soft and drifting, but heavy, angled, and punishing. It blanketed the town in white blindness, blurring the edges of everything familiar. In Rachel's small house at the end of Hazel Street, the lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered to the darkness. The power went out just after sunset. The hum of the refrigerator faded into silence, and the radio gave one last sputter before dying. Outside, the telephone line, already brittle from the cold, snapped somewhere down the road, silencing the only connection she had left with the outside world. Rachel stood in the middle of her living room, wrapped in 2 sweaters, staring at the unmoving light bulb above. She felt the isolation settle over her like a second winter. She moved carefully, lighting candles one by one, placing them around the room as if arranging tiny guards against the dark. The fireplace, long unused, was coaxed into life, its breath shallow but warm. She sat close, the dog at her feet, motionless but watchful. The flicker of the flames danced in the animal's dark eyes, reflecting something ancient and uncertain. Rachel placed another log into the fire, feeling the pull of fatigue in her limbs, the weariness that had grown heavier in recent months. As night deepened and the wind outside grew louder, a worry bloomed in her chest. The wood inside the house wouldn't last till morning. She had meant to bring more in earlier that day, but time had slipped by, as it often did. Now the stack was low, and the storm showed no sign of slowing. Her breath curled in the air. The heat was already fading. Just after midnight, when the cold began to bite through her second layer of clothing, Rachel decided to try. The thought of making it through the night without fire was worse than the risk of a short walk. The woodshed wasn't far, just down the side path, past the empty flower bed and around the corner of the house. She put on her boots slowly, fingers stiff against the laces, and pulled a coat over her shoulders. The dog watched her from the hearth, but did not follow. The front door opened with effort. Snow had piled against it, resisting her push like a warning. She stepped outside, and the wind met her with teeth. The cold was not sharp. It was deep, ancient, the kind that sank into the joints and pressed against the ribs. She moved slowly, feet crunching over the hard-packed snow, one hand pressed against the side of the house for balance. The flashlight she carried cast a narrow beam, quickly swallowed by the swirling white. She was halfway to the shed when it happened. Her foot found a patch of hidden ice beneath the snow. She slipped, her arms flailed for a moment in silence, and then gravity took hold. She landed hard on her side. The breath rushed from her lungs. A sharp pain exploded in her hip and down her leg. For a moment she couldn't move. The flashlight dropped into the snow, its beam turning skyward like a useless signal. She tried to sit up, but the pain anchored her. The wind shrieked over her body, tossing snow across her face, piling it over her coat. Her gloved hands scrabbled against the frozen ground, searching for leverage, but the strength wasn't there. She lay still, her pulse thudding against the cold inside her ears. The sky above her was dark, unbroken, without stars. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes, melting against the warmth of her skin. Her mind began to drift, pulled loose by shock and exhaustion. She thought of Frank, of the way he used to read the newspaper out loud every morning. She thought of the letters she never sent, folded and stored in drawers. She thought of the dog sleeping by the fire, unaware. Her breathing slowed. The pain began to dull into something distant, like a sound heard through thick glass. Her eyes closed. And then there was nothing. At the very moment Rachel fell into the snow, the dog stirred from her place by the fireplace. Something had changed. The stillness of the house had shifted in a way only instinct could detect. There was no sound, no call, no clear disturbance, just an absence where presence had been only moments before. She lifted her head slowly, ears alert, nose twitching toward the closed front door. The fire still flickered behind her, casting long shadows along the walls, but the warmth no longer felt complete. She moved toward the door, hesitantly at first, her body still weak from recovery. Her paws touched the cold wooden floor, and a small whimper escaped her chest. She scratched once, then again, pressing her weight against the lower panel. The door groaned but did not yield. She paced once in a tight circle, then returned to the frame and pressed again, harder this time, until the latch gave slightly. A sharp gust of wind filled the room, bringing with it the sting of the storm. The dog slipped through the gap into the darkness beyond. Outside, the snow bit at her face and sides, each flake a needle, each gust a wall. She moved slowly at first, then with more purpose, lowering her nose to the ground. The wind tore away most scents, scattering any clear trail, but still she pushed forward. She had no training, no understanding of what she was doing, only something deep and unspoken guiding her, something that told her this was wrong, that the person who had saved her was now lost. She moved past the porch, down the familiar path where Rachel often walked to the shed. The snow here was deeper, drifted into strange shapes that changed the landscape. She paused, sniffed, then veered left, circling toward the back of the property. Her paws sank deep into the crusted snow, legs trembling with the effort. Still, she did not stop. Behind the shed, partially shielded from the wind by a low slope of earth and the wall of the building, she found her. A barely visible shape beneath the snow, a mound where there should have been nothing. The flashlight lay nearby, its beam weak and fading, buried in white. The dog approached slowly, cautiously, nose quivering, and then she recognized the scent, cold, fading, but still present. Rachel was motionless, her body half covered by snow, one arm stretched out awkwardly beneath her coat. Her skin was pale, lips barely parted, her breath too shallow to see. The dog sniffed at her shoulder, then her cheek, stepping closer with trembling limbs. She circled once, then curled tightly against her side, pressing herself along the length of the woman's torso. She did not bark. She did not panic. She simply lay there, her thin frame pushed against Rachel's body, her breath slow and warm. The dog's ribs rose and fell steadily, her heartbeat strong and close. Snow continued to fall over them both, forming a white cocoon, erasing the line between body and ground. Still, she did not move. The wind howled through the trees, but the space behind the shed remained strangely calm, as if the world had paused there for a moment. Time passed without measure, marked only by the dog's breathing and the faint beat of warmth that passed between them. Dawn arrived without ceremony. A faint, colorless light crept across the sky, brushing the tops of trees and rooftops. The storm had not fully passed, but the worst of it had broken. The cold remained, sharp and unforgiving. From the road, a neighbor noticed the front door of the house hanging open. Curious, concerned, he crossed the yard, boots crunching over ice. He called out once, twice, then saw the path of disturbed snow leading behind the shed. Following it, he came upon a quiet, frozen scene. Two figures lying together, half buried in white. For a moment, it looked like a sculpture, still and solemn, shaped by wind and survival. He knelt beside them. The old woman's skin was cold, but there was breath, faint, shallow, real. The dog raised her head, slowly, blinking against the gray morning light, and then lowered it again onto Rachel's shoulder. She did not move away. Not yet. Help was called. Blankets arrived. But for those few minutes before others came, there was only the woman, the dog, and the silence of a storm that had tried and failed to take them both. 3 months had passed since the storm. The ice had melted, giving way to wet earth and the quiet anticipation of spring. The snowbanks receded like memory, and the trees along Hazel Street stretched their limbs toward pale sunlight. Rachel had healed slowly. Her body remained stiff, her steps uncertain, but the bruises had faded and the pain had lessened. She moved now with the help of a cane, her gait deliberate but steady. Each morning, she opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the new air, letting it fill the hollow spaces that winter had carved inside her. The dog had stayed. She had a name now. Betsy. It had come to Rachel one morning as naturally as the bloom of crocuses beneath the eaves. Betsy was no longer thin or trembling. Her fur had grown thick and healthy, her body stronger, though her quiet nature remained unchanged. She followed Rachel everywhere with calm devotion, never straying far, never demanding more than presence. Her eyes, dark and still, remained fixed on Rachel with the same gentle curiosity as the night they first met. The house had changed, not drastically, but in ways that mattered. The windows stayed open longer during the day, the curtains drawn back to let light pool on the hardwood floors. Dust that had once settled undisturbed was swept away. Rachel began to cook again, not just for herself, but for others. Pies appeared on neighbors' porches, wrapped in foil and left without note. She wrote letters to her daughter, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet desire to reconnect. The pen moved across the page more easily now. Outside, near the window that faced east, she had begun to plant flowers. At first, just pansies and marigolds, then more. Lavender, sage, a row of tulips that bent gently in the morning breeze. She wore old gloves and moved slowly in the dirt, her cane propped beside her like a watching sentinel. Betsy sat nearby, ears alert, head resting on her front paws. She did not interfere, only remained close, her presence a kind of warmth that needed no explanation. Life had not returned all at once. It had crept back into the corners of the house, settled into the folds of Rachel's routine. It came not with grand gestures, but in quiet moments, a warm mug between her palms, the feel of sunshine on her face, the sound of birds returning to the trees. Betsy did not save her every day. She didn't need to. Her rescue had already been done, and the echo of it lingered in every shared silence, every slow step, every breath taken with intention. Rachel no longer feared the silence. It was no longer empty. It was full of small things. The soft tap of Betsy's paws across the floor, the creak of the rocking chair, the rustle of letters folded and placed into envelopes. She had begun to sleep more deeply. She dreamed, sometimes of snow, sometimes of warmth, but always with the feeling that something precious had been returned. When summer finally arrived, Rachel stood at the kitchen window one morning and pushed it open. The air was thick with life, cut grass, distant thunder, the scent of lilac. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hand on the sill, and breathed in deeply. A breeze moved through the room, lifting the edge of a curtain, carrying with it a quiet promise. Betsy lay on the rug behind her, eyes closed, tail gently tapping the floor. Rachel didn't speak, but in the stillness, a thought moved through her like light through a tree canopy. She was not finished. There was still something left, something worth waking for, worth tending to, worth continuing, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it.